From Studio DRC at the Daytona Regional Chamber of Commerce, this is the Crest of the Wave. Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Crest of the Wave, the Daytona Regional Chamber's podcast for the business community. I'm Ken Phelps, Vice President of Resource Development. Glad to have you along on this episode, a very important topic on our legislative priorities. And so I'm pleased to welcome a pair of guests this month, our Chair of the Cornerstone Committee and partner at Cobb Cole Law Firm, Jessica Gao. Jessica, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And then we're also joined by my colleague here in the office, our Director of Advocacy, David Robinson. David, thanks for sharing some time.
Thank you for having me, Ken.
So, very important time coming up because legislative session in Tallahassee is about to get underway. One of the cornerstones, I guess we can call it the Cornerstone Committee, one of the primary things we do here at the Daytona Regional Chamber is to advocate for the business community. And that's a big ask and a broad topic because you've got small businesses, large businesses, a variety of industries. Each year, we put together legislative priorities that we take to Tallahassee for Volusia Days. So, Jessica, I'll start with you as chair of the committee. Can you share a little bit for our members who may not be familiar with this process, how these priorities are determined when you decide what are they going to be and how do we rank them in terms of importance?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think that member input is the key, or touchstone of the cornerstone, if you will. And so we put together a metric and survey that goes to all of our members, asking them to rank listed priorities and then allows them to also add additional insights or topics that we didn't cover. We then take that survey data and we give it a weighted average of their ranking to create our legislative priorities for the year. So we'll go over that, but really we want to make sure that the items that we are pushing the hardest are the ones that are the nearest and dearest to our membership.
That's absolutely true.
David, can you touch a little bit on how much effort's put behind getting that survey out to ensure you get a good sample of responses from across the membership? Because if you got 2 or 3 responses, obviously you're not getting a good pulse of what's happening in the membership. So what do we do to make sure we're really gathering the voice of our membership?
Absolutely. So this past year, we actually did something different, and we actually did a campaign. And it was Your Voice, Your Future. It was a way to kind of get some excitement behind it. As you know, sometimes getting surveys can be harder, but I am excited to say that we got a good amount back where we were able to really gauge well on things that we should be advocating for up at the state legislature and even at the local level. And so I said that really made a big difference this year. So sending out emails, making sure our board of directors are also kept up to date. That's very, very important. And so things like that really helped us drive out the responses that we got of over 900 businesses that we surveyed.
Very good.
And I would say kudos to David for the campaign and to our members for being involved. We've had years where we've had 10 or 20 handfuls of responses. I think this year we had an overwhelming number that went into forming this.
Yeah, great support from our members. So definitely shout out to them.
Well, it's important because it makes our work that much more effective when we're actually going and talking to the state. So let's dive into our legislative priorities. For those of you that are watching or listening, they are on our website. You're able to access those. You can always contact David or Jessica if you have specific questions, but there's a lot to get to. I know when I first saw them come out in the report, I was really struck by the top priority. And I think it's one that on the surface may not be immediately associated with as a business cause. I think most people would say it's more broad. But the number one priority this year is flooding, stormwater, and coastal resiliency. But it is a major impact on businesses because we saw in these storms the last several years how much business was affected by that those storms, whether Milton, Ian. It's going back several years now. Talk about what some of the feedback was. Why is this the number one priority for the business community this year?
Yeah, I think that it's a priority for the business community and our just community at large. So I think the chamber, one of our strengths is that we live and work here. And so every issue that you see on this list is an issue that impacts us day to day, not from a national business perspective, but also from how we operate in our community. So flooding, stormwater, coastal resiliency, easy thing to tackle, right? Not complicated at all, but I think that looking at disaster recovery, looking at why employers want to be located here, what our strengths are as a community, and the growth climate moving forward, how that impacts economics, job creation, all of those things that are near and dear to us as a chamber and to our members tie into flooding and some of the other infrastructure items we see on our policy list. But I think overwhelmingly we are residents of Volusia County. We have members who may not live here, but we're all involved in this community. And so looking at, like you said, those large storm events, but taking it further than that, how do we capitalize on our coastal element that we have and how that impacts our economy and the driving force of our tourist activity here and how we continue to grow. Stormwater itself is not tied to hurricanes or adverse weather events. It's, what areas of our community may be a little outdated and need some assistance that we can look at as a community impact. And how do we put in the infrastructure to support our continued growth and prosperity?
Absolutely.
I think it's one of those, it seems so obvious when you present it in that way because, Daytona Beach is known as the world's most famous beach.
Absolutely.
That beach took a battering in storms over the last several years, and it's certainly a huge economic driver. What are some of the things that were talked about in the committee that when we talked to the state legislator and our delegation, that we are looking for them to address under that big umbrella of coastal resiliency, stormwater, flooding? What are some of the key items we're going to ask about?
Yeah, so there's definitely a handful. I would say that the main priority is funding. So on the local level here at both the county and all of our local governments, you talked about after the storms, the battering the beach took, and some just infrastructure failures that we saw. We know what the problem areas are. I think that the local government staff members and some of our business community have done a fantastic job to say this is where this failure occurred and here's why. But sometimes the fixes are multi-million-dollar issues that we get some, state and federal funding after disasters that go to the highest priority. But to get us to a level where we feel comfortable that we are where we want to be from a resilience standpoint, I think it's going to take some proactive measures and leaning on state funding and the legislature on anything they can do to make that easier, I think is key to our members. And also anything they can do to simplify the regulatory aspects of, beach renourishment, getting our beaches, back to where they need to be, looking at the permitting process. I think after the storms, we had great input and outreach from the state level and community resiliency and getting us back to where we needed to be. I think that some of our communities would argue that we're still not there. We're still recovering. The declaration of emergency for Hurricane Ian is still active. And so I think the state has addressed and said, we know that this is going to have a long-term impact, and we're still there. So working with them as partners on how we keep going forward is going to be a large item.
David, for our members who may not be aware, can you share with them kind of our policy of open door, or reaching out to be able to let you know what they're experiencing so that we can get that good cross representation of the membership community? Obviously we did the survey on these legislative needs, but when there is a specific issue, whether it's in the wake of a storm or some other kind of case, talk about the ways in which you can be of assistance to the members.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's actually a great point. We do have an open door policy here. So you're able to reach me by email or by my phone number, right? So my email is david at DaytonaChamber.com. And what you can do is you reach out. And then from there, if I do not know the answer or one of my colleagues here at the Chamber does not know the answer, I will then reach out to our contacts at the state and even the federal level, the Office of Senator Rick Scott. They also held some office hours here at the Chamber as well. So those are just a couple of ways that I can assist you and the rest of us here at the Chamber.
And I would encourage everybody listening or watching to take advantage of that.
Yes.
Because I would say 99% of the time you're not the only one dealing with that issue. The more we know about it, the better we can advocate, because there is power in number and in volume. So
absolutely.
At the risk of taking days to go through all of our topics, let's move on to the second priority. This is one also, it's probably a little more obviously connected to business, but this touches every single resident in our community in some way, shape, or form, and that's property insurance affordability. This has been a topic for a few years because there has been legislation passed, but why does this continue to bubble to the top? Obviously, based on this, I would say still a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely. I think that property insurance affordability, you hear the legislature talk about it as a key priority when we're up there talking to them as well. We had some groundbreaking legislation in the past few years. We've seen that result in a few more carriers entering the state market. But I think that we're still seeing the effects and outcome of that legislation. So I think that this year it's a little more of monitoring,
Yes.
seeing how the rates go down. When we went with the Florida Chamber and did the legislative fly-in a few weeks ago, one of the key topics was that we have rate decreases proposed in Florida. And that on a national level, we have a pretty good insurance outlook for this year that's proposed. So seeing the starting impacts of that legislation a few years ago, I think this year's priority is seeing what happens with that.
Yes.
If we need to tweak or further expand that legislation and how it impacts us here in Volusia and how we can, ask our state to support.
Absolutely.
I know a lot of people will be happy to hear the words rate decreases.
Absolutely.
That's been a challenge for a few years. Next up, and kind of related to this topic, infrastructure and road improvements. It's one of those things you take for granted. Like you always just take for granted. You're going to hit the light switch and the lights are going to come on. You're going to call 911 and there's going to be somebody there to answer. Being able to successfully navigate the community is a challenge as well. David, touch on this from a commerce standpoint. I mean, it's not just about, we'd like to have nice roads to be able to drive on. It's about moving commerce and moving goods and services and visitors. We're on the cusp of Bike Week here, so there's going to be a lot of visitors coming in and using our infrastructure. Talk about how we're prioritizing that for our membership and what the impact should be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Efficiency is very important. And dealing with businesses, so that does make a difference in how we move about in our society. So we are looking at things like funding for larger projects, right? And then also partnerships with development community on alternative road layouts too. But I would definitely say the biggest part in which that plays is really like the efficiency of how things are moving, because if things aren't moving within our region efficiently, it definitely affects the production of our businesses, and even employees. That's very important. Employees being able to get to work every day. Things that we may not. We may look at it and see, oh my goodness, my in front of my house, or we really personalize it, but there is a really greater impact, economic impact that does affect everyday people going into their jobs.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of growth over the last 8 to 10 years in this region, and part of the power of this is to be able to have the connections to bend the ear of the key people at the local or state level. I share briefly, I'll give you a moment to share. Yeah. We've got Florida Department of Transportation Secretary Jared Perdue, who will be coming to be able to speak to the membership.
Yes.
Remind myself and our listeners and viewers like dates and how they can check that out.
Absolutely. So for our Eggs and Issues on May 8th, at the Halifax River Yacht Club. It starts at 7:30. Our Transportation Secretary Perdue, will be our keynote speaker for that morning. So we're really excited to have him.
And how powerful to be able to get in the room with somebody at that level.
Absolutely.
To be able to speak there. Jessica, I know in your work you do a lot with growth and that kind of stuff. Can you talk about how this fits with the growth we've seen? I mean, when I moved back to the community from Pennsylvania in 2016, Tanger was just getting started. Margaritaville was just getting started. One Daytona was still under construction. Mm-hmm. So much has progressed. Do we expect to see that continued kind of growth? And how are we managing the infrastructure to be able to handle all the new folks that are coming into those areas?
Absolutely, and it's a great question. And I'll say that, before the storms of a few years ago, I think infrastructure and road improvements were our number one priority. And so I think we've seen that take a little bit of a backseat to the environmental concerns we've had right now. But I think this remains at the forefront in kind of everything we do. I think you look at the cycles of economic growth, especially on the development side. Think back to, I'll say 10 years ago, which seems strange that it was over 10 years ago, where Volusia County did not really implement impact fees for new development because they were trying to bring growth to this community. And I think a lot of what we see in terms of infrastructure planning, and it has been said, is that the Daytona region has seen a period of explosive growth, which is all of the growth that we planned for in the early 2000s and even before that was finally getting under construction. And it all happened at once, which is fantastic for capital markets, for tax base, for job creation, but it creates some growing pains, as you say. And so I think right now we are poised to have a little bit of a market leveling because we've had such an explosion of growth and it's there now. But we know the plan for what facilities are needed. Infrastructure goes beyond roads. That's an easy one to visualize. Here in the Daytona region, you look at the LPGA bridge, right? There's been a plan for widening of that for over a decade. We now have the growth there to support putting the pressure on kind of state and local actors to get that funding in place and get that construction going. Ideally, we do it lockstep. So David mentioned working with the development community to create alternative avenues for transportation improvements while we're waiting on state funding to come in. I think that's key. I think it gets back to our members being a part of the local business community and experiencing that. We want our employers on time. We want them to have good options for lunch that they can drive to within the time they have. But it goes beyond roads. If you look at power infrastructure,
yes.
How do we tee it up for new industrial development on the edges of town or within the airport plan to come forward? What do we need to do in terms of master planning for a new substation? How are our water and sewer lines tying in? All of those aspects go into infrastructure planning, and while I think roads will continue to be the forefront, it's because we have a pretty good handle on the other ones. And we've got plans in place for road infrastructure that will continue.
Yeah, we some months ago we had Colleen Nicklin from what is now the Volusia Flagler TPO. It was River to Sea previously. For those of you that are interested in that topic, I encourage you to go back and listen to that conversation we had with her. Very insightful, and you touched on it about it's more than just roads. I mean, you're talking about bike paths and greenways and walkability and all sorts of things, and it's a really a broad topic to try and get your brains wrapped around. We talk about the explosive growth. One of the things that people need, we're bringing all these people to the community. One of the things they need is a place to live. So affordable housing is number 4 for us on the priorities.
Absolutely.
Touch on that conversation because that's also been something that's kind of been in conversations for several years. David, let's start with you and then we'll get Jessica, get your input just on where does that conversation stand now as we've been working on this for a few years?
Yeah, so I think it's still going back to, the workers and those for our businesses, right? Growth is amazing. It's something that we are passionate about. But here at the Chamber, it is important that we also not forget those, right? Not just the owners, but those who are attending there. So going back to things like getting to work, right? Well, where are they traveling from? We don't want to create an environment that, will force people to live out of the area, travel distances longer. As far as, longevity in that company may have to be shortened because they may have to find something closer to them. So that's definitely like a key conversation. And what we don't want to forget when thinking about affordable housing and economic growth with our businesses.
Yeah. Jessica, your thoughts?
Yeah, affordable housing is, I think, a challenge that will continue. I mean, it's something that is a national issue.
For sure.
It is not unique to Daytona Beach, but the Daytona Beach regional area, specifically the 32114 zip code, is one of the most economically depressed zip codes in the state. And so looking at the challenges that poses and how we rise above that as a community is something that I think the Chamber is passionate about, and that we definitely want to partner with our state legislative incentives and outreach efforts to bring funding back for affordable housing in our community. When you look at our market, Daytona Beach has a lot of outdated housing stock that when you look at in terms of access to affordable housing, you don't take them into account because of their age. And that overlaps a little bit into our flooding priority because a lot of those, especially in the historic Midtown area, are below base flood elevation. And so it's a challenge that hits a lot of our priority topics. So looking at state programs where you can help raise homes above the base flood and things like that, bringing that into our community is going to be, absolutely key as we're having those discussions with the state.
Absolutely.
Well, that actually transitions well to the next priority, number 5 on our list is workforce availability and training. the availability is a piece you touched on a minute ago, David, in terms of the ability to travel. Thinking about our tourism industry, you've got all those hotels beachside. A lot of their frontline workers are lower wage positions, but those folks aren't likely to live beachside, so travel becomes an issue for them on occasion. Aside from that, my experience with some of the programs I've gone through with the U.S. Chamber, we need people just in sheer numbers to fill open jobs. We've got fewer people looking for work than we have open jobs, and that has been a trend since 2017, with the exception of a brief flip during COVID when unemployment spiked. But the ability of a good workforce drives commerce, it drives innovation, it supports business growth. We've got some great initiatives underway. Talk about from an advocacy and legislative standpoint, workforce availability. What are the key numbers there?
I think in the discussions that we'll have at the state level, it's bringing back funding for different programs. So we have amazing secondary and post-secondary institutions in our community who have programs for workforce training. Part of it is bringing funding back for those nonprofits and for the organizations that are hosting it. I think really finding some of the work that the Chamber has done on education and outreach on, what is your best aptitude? Where should we be placing you in terms of these programs so that we can have our talent, stay in this community and give back. One of the metrics that has been tossed around lately is around 16% of Daytona Beach residents work in Daytona Beach. And so how do we flip that on its head? How do we get people who live here to stay here and to give back to our community, and how do we support them in that effort? A lot of it is the trades that we offer and the different employment opportunities and really making those connections.
Yeah. And even to add to that, to Jessica's point, having the options, right? Promoting those options. Sometimes, one career may be favored over another. So it is important, as a Chamber of Commerce that, we play a role in discussing this and being at the forefront of this conversation of, really promoting those, because some may not even know it exists. So even amping up our efforts in that area too.
Agreed. And I think it's another area where, as a Chamber of Commerce, there is perhaps some disconnect on why is the Chamber involved in a given issue. And what comes to mind is the initiative we just rolled out in December. It's a product of a Leadership Daytona class, so you get into some leadership development stuff there. But the Readers to Leaders initiative, that's a partnership with the Chamber, the Leadership Daytona Alumni Council, the Early Learning Coalition of Flagler, Volusia, and Volusia County Schools, and it's just to start youth literacy. We looked a couple of years ago at our third grade reading scores in Volusia County, and they were low. It was around 50%. We've seen some growth in that. We've seen some initiative, but I think people are realizing that's a community problem, not just a business problem or a chamber problem. It speaks to that workforce availability. We know if you're not reading on grade level by third grade, the numbers of you becoming involved with the justice system or needing social services or not graduating high school or not being able to find quality employment it goes up significantly. And I think people perhaps underestimate that, but that's another area where the Chamber's involved, and it might not be quite so obvious why. The last two, let's touch on those quickly before we get wrapped up here. Economic development funding. We have seen in the news in the last few months some really fascinating businesses choosing Volusia County as a place to come and want to do business. Mm-hmm. For so long, we've been known as the tourism place, coming in, and it's all about tourism. But we're really starting to be able to diversify our industry base, which will protect tourism, because when we see a situation like COVID and people stop traveling, our economy really took a hit. To the extent we can diversify, that's going to protect them, because maybe instead of visitors coming in, it's staycations and it's local people filling our rooms. Talk about economic development funding and why that's such important to continue to capitalize on the growth we've seen.
Yeah, as it relates to Chamber members specifically, I think that diversifying the economy of the Daytona region is important. If you look at greater tax base, the improvements to quality of life, the lower regulatory costs increase the ability to tie into kind of all of these, where perhaps you have less costs up front because of the regulatory environment of the county or region you're located in. So you can afford to cover more employment insurance costs, or you can subsidize housing in the area. There's partnerships between the business community and the local government level that I think are really key in having economic drivers in our community. create the baseline funding for those efforts. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And even adding to, I'll jump to the healthcare insurance affordability, even how that ties to one of our second, which is the property insurance affordability, right? And having that market-based structure, that option there, because again, the higher cost for healthcare, affects both the owner, the business developer, as well as those who are working there. So,
and at a state level, I would say that we're in an environment with new technologies and innovation where you can work anywhere. Businesses can be located anywhere and kind of make it work from a supply chain metric. But I think that more and more we will see the decisions that are made based on the quality of life that are available in those locations, and the regulatory environment, along with some of these key items. The Florida Chamber has noted that when businesses are looking at where to locate, regulatory environment is a key aspect, and so is the availability of housing for their workforce.
Yes.
The number of employees in that area that are available. So all of our legislative priorities give an echo to the need statewide that large business owners are seeing.
Absolutely.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, either of you. I think Volusia County residents, Daytona Regional Chamber members, business leaders should not underestimate the impact we can have in these conversations as well, because insurance is an industry where we have several headquartered in our community. So we have access to high-level leadership in that industry, whether you're talking about Brown & Brown, Foundation Risk Partners, Security First, Florida Healthcare Plans. Mm-hmm. It's not just one type of carrier either. Can you touch on briefly the importance of having that level of industry and that level of leadership to be able to move the needle on a topic like that?
Yeah, and I'll touch briefly on it, and then David probably has more thoughts. I think that one of the largest strengths of the Daytona region, and especially our chamber, is that we have individuals in those positions who are so passionate about Volusia County and where they live. And so you have all of these individuals who have the ear of policymakers at the state and federal level, who are saying, this is an issue that I'm seeing that would really help us out. And at the end of the day, we're all people. Those connections are the key that makes change happen. And so it's having those discussions and having chamber members and community members who are so passionate about what they want to see in our community that we see that impact coming forward.
Absolutely. And not just to not to repeat what Jessica said, but that uniqueness really should be highlighted, right? As she mentioned, the different high-level executives who, have the policy makers ear, really helps us as at the chamber do our job better too, right? My job, being an advocacy and really pushing for our members, but also, like the greater community as well, being able to have that one call away or that one email away really has helped, in my role has made my job easier. So,
yeah. Well, I appreciate you both taking the time to share some insights, not only in this process, but what are we prioritizing for this coming year? And I think it's important for our members to know. I will share quickly. We've got, if you're watching this, I'm assuming you have some advocacy bent in your interest toward the Daytona Regional Chamber. You definitely want to mark your calendars for Eggs and Issues, March 13th. Hopefully you're watching or listening to this before then. We're going to have a State of the City with Daytona Beach Mayor Derek Henry. There's a lot happening within the city limits of Daytona Beach I think you'll be excited to learn about. I want to ask you to both to quickly promote what we've got coming up at the end of March, tied in with the legislative session and Volusia Days. So I'll leave it to you to decide who goes first on that.
I'll go ahead and jump in. But Volusia Days, which will be held on March 31st and April 1st. It's a really fun time and an informative time where we bring some of our members up to Tallahassee and we get to meet with department agency heads, and they'll come out and they'll speak to us. And also we have like a fun cocktail hour, a breakfast. So really excited about that. We have confirmed our insurance commissioner, Michael Jaworski, and then also our deputy environmental Deputy Secretary of Environmental Protection, has also confirmed to speak to. So, and more confirmations to follow. So if you have any questions regarding that, feel free to reach out to me. Again, my email is david@daytonachamber.com. And I also want to add, if you don't mind,
sure.
Just to kind of add to the conversation, our Where We Stand document, that can be found on DaytonaChamber.com. And this will we gave a high level overview of our priorities, but this kind of gives a more in-depth explanation of how we reach our, I guess I would say, our baseline, and for what we are advocating for during these sessions and for our priorities. So I encourage everyone to look at this document. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Very good. You've been to Volusia Days, yes?
Just a few times, yeah.
Okay, so for the folks that might be like, well, I don't know if I want to go or not, share the experience from a participant standpoint.
Absolutely. Volusia Days is an absolute, I would say, game changer. If you're not familiar with the legislative environment in Tallahassee, if you didn't go to law school there like I did and see them tromping up and down the hill every day, it is fascinating to see the legislative body at work. We put ours on the schedule a little later in session so that our members get a little bit of insight into what's being finalized, what bills have already been adopted. So you are the first to kind of hear of some major changes that are going to impact our community. And the key part of Volusia Days is building on those connections that we talked about, is putting you in a position to have that relationship with agency heads that you may need later on in your business, or just our local delegation, who's always been fantastic in coordinating with the chamber. It is a very fun time. You get to build connections with our chamber members and also our delegation. And the work is kind of teed up to be celebrated at that point. I think this Friday is the deadline for bill filing of new laws. So David will be busy between now and then reviewing and seeing what will impact our community and how we can help move that forward.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks to you both for taking some time and going a little bit of depth into this. I think it's such important work that we do that the particularly the small business owners, that they're busy in their business.
Absolutely.
They don't have the time to go and kind of be at the forefront of all of these, so we're happy to be able to do that for them. That's going to put a wrap on this episode of Crest of the Wave. It's an in-depth conversation and something we could talk for probably another hour or two at least on this topic. So I encourage you, if you have questions or would like more information, reach out to us here at the Daytona Regional Chamber. Contact David directly. He'd be happy to hear from you and talk through with you what your concerns and needs are. If you have not already, subscribe to Crest of the Wave. We're on all the major audio platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, wherever you're getting your podcasts. If you're watching this, obviously, you've seen it on our YouTube channel. I hope you would subscribe there to be able to get updates when new content is released. And with that, we'll put the wraps on it. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll see you again soon. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. For more information on our business community, visit our website at DaytonaChamber.com. Until next time, be ready to catch the next Crest of the Wave.